Welcome to Plain Civics. Thank you for joining us. I'm Joe Ulery.
And I'm Bobbi Fisher.
Our goal is to break down how government works so you can make the government work for you.
In our continuing short series, we present the civic virtues that Benjamin Franklin, one of our most significant founders, thought to be the most important. He thought these civic virtues, or qualities that help individuals become better people and contribute to a stronger society, mattered just as much as public action. As we work our way through these, think about how these civic virtues track in your own life. The 12th civic virtue is chastity. Franklin said, "Rarely use venery, but for health or offspring, never to dullness, weakness, or the injury of your own or another's peace or reputation." End quote. When have you been able to control your desires purposefully? If you aren't sure what his term venery means, it's gratification of sexual desire. We have one more virtue to go after this one.
All right, so today we're talking about the 250th anniversary of the United States, or the birthday of the United States, and there is a fancy word for this 250th.
Semi-quincentennial.
So we're going to talk about that. Let's get to work, Bobbi.
And now our feature presentation.
I titled this America at 250, What Are We Actually Celebrating? July 4th, 2026 is the 250th birthday of the United States of America, but it's really not that simple. As we approach the 250th birthday of American independence, this is a great time to review what we are actually celebrating. On March 13th, 2025, in our episode 5, which was titled, What is the Declaration of Independence?, we examined the origins and importance of the Declaration of Independence. But in this episode, we are going to dig a bit deeper and more in terms of what it means at 250 years. Think of the Declaration of Independence as the most important breakup letter in the history of the world. The fledgling 13 American colonies were breaking up with what was, at that time, the largest and most powerful country in the world, England, or the British Empire. You'll hear England and Britain interchange, so keep in mind it's the same thing. I think it's sometimes which one fits better. The colonists, in particular the colonial leaders, were putting a lot on the line by declaring independence. When we talk about the Declaration, it is not a set of laws, as many people erroneously think, and we explained that in our earlier episode. It is our statement of separation from England, severing our ties politically and economically and everything else along with them. If anything, it is the birth certificate of the United States. Let's review the history leading up to the Declaration of Independence, and then we will talk about the legacy of it and how we maintain that legacy. The first successful English colony in North America was Jamestown, which was founded in 1607 and eventually became the colony of Virginia. Following Jamestown in 1607 and up until 1732, 12 more colonies were established and settled along the east coast of America. Although a couple of the colonies were originally settled by people from other European countries, all 13 colonies had come under British control by the 1700s. The colonies belonged to England and were part of the British Empire. The colonists considered themselves British subjects or citizens and were loyal to the Crown or the King of England and Parliament. But due to the distance of the colonies from England and the slowness of travel and communication, remember they didn't have any telephones or airplanes or anything like that, the 13 colonies had been allowed to govern themselves locally since the beginning. So they had become self-sufficient. They had created their own local colonial governments, generally patterned after the government and laws of England, and they hadn't had a lot of input or interference from the king and parliament until after the French and Indian War, which was 1754 to 1763. And also, if you're a European historian, it's known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, because it was fought on two fronts, in Europe and in North America. This war, and it actually started in Europe, was actually between several European countries, but in North America, it was between the French and the British. And they were fighting on the frontier in the area, basically what we call the Great Lakes or Ohio Valley region today, south of the Great Lakes, east of the Mississippi, north of the Ohio River. And I want to explain the name because I know kids used to be confused about why is it the French and Indian War? It makes you think the French and the Indians were fighting. Right. Actually, it was the French and the Native Americans or the Indians were helping each other, trying to maintain that land in that area. And it was the British, along with the colonists fighting for them, who were fighting against them, trying to gain control of that Ohio Valley area. So we call it the French and Indian War because that's who we were fighting against. England or Britain calls it the 7 Years' War.
You mentioned Jamestown earlier, and a lot of these places, the colonies and locations, are named after royalty.
Right, King James.
Named after King James. We talk. It became Virginia. You talk about that, and Virginia is in honor of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. So we see lots of these things going on. Charleston is named after Charles II. So I just thought that'd be a fun fact.
New York, the Duke of York.
Yeah, and if you go through all of America, you're going to find these towns and cities and counties named after a lot of these. Georgia,
right.
Lots of things.
Thinking of the Revolutionary War, if you look at like Indiana, for example, north of the county I live in, Cass County, which is named after a famous person who was from Michigan, I believe. You have Pulaski County, which was named after Casimir Pulaski, who was the Polish soldier that came over here and trained some of Washington's troops. We have Steuben County up in the north.
Tippecanoe County.
Steuben was a German that came and helped train.
There's so much history steeped in that we walk by every day and don't take a moment to appreciate. It's
Lafayette, named after
Lafayette.
Washington's right-hand Frenchman.
Yeah.
So, lots of that. Back to what they were fighting over in the French and Indian War. Control of this land in North America, both the French wanted to maintain control and the British, of course, wanted to take control to add to their enlarging empire. The British and the colonists end up prevailing over the French in North America, and the French give them the land that they claimed east of the Mississippi River, which again is the area of the Ohio Valley. The British were left, though, after this war with large debts. So British leaders decided to increase taxation and control of the 13 colonies as a means to raise money to help pay these debts. Parliament directly levied several duties and excise taxes on the colonies, beginning with the Sugar Act of 1764. Once they passed the Stamp Act of 1765, colonists began protesting because Parliament was bypassing the colonial legislatures in order to pass these taxes. So the colonists had no say in these taxes that were being passed on them. And Americans began to insist on this principle of no taxation without representation, as I'm sure all of you learned back in your 5th and 8th grade social studies classes. As the colonists did not have any representatives in the British Parliament, they felt like all these taxes being levied was a violation of their rights as Englishmen for taxes to be imposed upon them without their input. Parliament rejected the colonial protests and asserted its authority by passing new taxes and restrictions. And it would have made this too long to go through all of them, but just understand there were many more than the ones, that I've already mentioned here. So then in 1763, Parliament passed the Proclamation of 1763, which was right after the French and Indian War, and it restricted colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. So in other words, now we've gotten this land of the Ohio Valley, but you can't go there and settle. So another restriction, it wasn't a tax, but it was another restriction on the colonists. The colonists had formally asked the king and parliament several times, including by the Stamp Act Congress in 1765, when 9 of the colonies sent representatives to New York to write formal petitions to the British government, asking them to stop the taxation. The British government ignored their requests or refused them. Colonists continued their protests, and colonial discontent grew after the passage of the 1773 Tea Act, which reduced taxes on tea sold by the East India Company in an effort to undercut the competition. In other words, they created a monopoly on the tea trade, which, of course, was very important because that's what people drank back then was
naturally tea. Tea time. And
right.
We keep talking about the Stamp Act, and I just want to think out loud for a second when I hear Stamp Act, because I didn't grow up in the 1700s. I think of, is that like a postage stamp? But it really was a different kind of stamp, right? That had to be on products.
It was like an embossed, like if you get a notary today, it was like, they had those things that would emboss the paper, press it down, and put their little symbol on it. And so those had to be officially done. And sometimes I was even reading some items had to be actually sent back to England.
Oh my gosh.
To be stamped by an appropriate authority. So that would, delay. It wasn't like you could just run to the corner and get it done.
Yeah,
so.
There was no Amazon at the time, so there wasn't overnight delivery. So you could already feel the pressure in the teapot starting to build.
And the Tea Act angered the colonists even more, and Americans in each colony boycotted the tea. American resistance came to a head on December 16th, 1773, when some Bostonians dressed as Native Americans dumped thousands of pounds of tea into the Boston harbor during what is known as the Boston Tea Party. Tensions escalated in 1774 as Parliament then passed the laws known as the Intolerable Acts. That's what they were known as by the colonists. They were actually called the Coercive Acts by the British, which greatly restricted self-government in the colony of Massachusetts because that's where the Boston Tea Party took place. So they thought these people of Massachusetts, they're really
troublemakers.
Extreme, troublemakers. If you think of the word coercive, they were, trying to really put the clamps down on the people of Massachusetts.
And I would imagine
that's why they called them intolerable.
Yeah, and I would imagine at the time that you didn't want to seem suspicious, and you were working to try to overthrow the British or get the revolution, that you didn't want to be seen in public with certain people, and that they were really cracking down on that. So you had to kind of almost go underground to have these meetings.
And I didn't even mention it in this episode because I think we talked about it in the earlier one, but we had part of the protests were like tax collectors would even be caught sometimes and tarred and feathered, or they would make dummy effigies and hang them from the trees and burn them, as a symbolism of these nasty tax collectors. So, the protests went pretty deep in many of these areas, especially in and around Boston, which seemed to be the hotbed.
It was.
The new Intolerable Acts also allowed the British military commanders to claim colonial homes for the quartering of soldiers. And quartering, we've talked about before, it just means they're not like chopping them up. That's not what it means. It means housing them. Think of our Third Amendment to the Constitution.
I was just going to say that this was such a sticky thing that it made it into the Constitution.
Yeah. And so when you read through the Bill of Rights and you get to the Third Amendment, you think, why are they saying you can't? Yeah. I mean, that's what it goes back to. So
do you think about how awkward that would be if, especially, right, if you were for the revolution and you had to quarter the British soldiers in your house? How awkward would that be?
Well, sometimes they would even kick the people out of their homes and just take them over.
Sleep in the barn, yeah.
Right. These were forced onto these American civilians, and they didn't have a choice. They didn't say, hey, do you mind if we stay here? No. It was forced upon them. So the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in September 1774 to coordinate an official response to these latest British actions. Congress organized a boycott of British goods and petitioned the king again to repeal the acts and taxes. In response, King George sent more soldiers to the colonies to enforce the acts. The Parliament and King George III were increasingly taking more and more of the colonists' freedoms away from them, which came as quite a shock to some of the colonies because, after all, they had been largely allowed to self-govern and not be dependent on the king and Parliament for over 100 years. Despite the physical distance between the colonies and England, and the self-sufficiency of the colonies for over 100 years, the colonies did still feel extreme loyalty to the king and the mother country. So after the English started passing all of these tax laws and other restrictive laws, it makes sense that the colonists would be upset because they felt the English government was not treating them as loyal subjects or citizens that were due the same respect and subject to the same laws as their fellow British subjects who actually lived in England. However, not all colonists were in favor of the boycotts or taking any action against the British Crown and government. And these colonists numbered around 15 to 20% of the colonial population, and they were known as the Loyalists or sometimes you'll see them called the Tories. The majority of colonists eventually favored independence, and those colonists were called the Patriots. By April 1775, tensions in the colonies, especially around Boston, were boiling over. The British government had sent more troops to America, especially to the Boston area, and the government would not relax any of the taxes and restrictions on the colonists. Despite the hope of many for resolution of their differences, tensions escalated and came to a head at the Concord Bridge outside of Boston on April 19, 1775, when British redcoats and colonial militia fired shots at each other. It was like a small group of redcoats and colonial militia. It wasn't like they sent the whole army here. They just happened to run across each other at this Concord Bridge. And there ended up being a small skirmish with a few minor casualties, but this began the American Revolution, and no one really knows who fired the first shot, or what we've called before, from the famous poem, Concord Bridge, the shot heard round the world. But the king declared the colonists, quote, in a state of open and avowed rebellion, end quote. For the first time, many colonists began to seriously consider cutting ties with Britain. The publication of Thomas Paine's stirring pamphlet called Common Sense in early 1776 lit a fire under this previously unthinkable idea. In his widely read pamphlet, Paine advocated for American independence. His pamphlet was written in clear and persuasive prose, with Paine providing both moral and political arguments to encourage common people in the colonies to fight for independence from Britain. And I might add, Paine was a British citizen. He had just recently come over here at the insistence of Benjamin Franklin, who had befriended Paine when Franklin was in England. Colonial leaders believed that there was no turning back now. The movement for independence was now in full swing. So in response, the Second Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia in May of 1775 to again discuss how to deal with the British aggression against the colonies. In early July 1775, they drafted and sent another petition. This one's known as the Olive Branch Petition because the olive branch is a symbol of peace. To the king and parliament, seeking to end any further aggression and asking for the repeal of the Intolerable Acts. By the time King George III received this petition, he had already issued his proclamation of rebellion, declaring the 13 colonies to be in a state of open rebellion and ordering, quote, all our officers and all our obedient and loyal subjects to use their utmost endeavors to withstand and suppress such rebellion, end quote. Many colonists, especially colonial leaders, began to see that there was little promise for reconciliation and that only two realistic options existed. One was complete independence, which made war with the British practically inevitable, or give up and give complete submission to British colonial rule. Colonial discontent grew over further British aggression and a couple more battles that had been fought. Colonial legislatures were slowly giving their approval for the Continental Congress to meet again and decide what the next steps would be. Virginia was finally moved toward calling for independence when the Virginia Convention allowed Richard Henry Lee to present what is now known as the Lee Resolution to the Second Continental Congress on June 7, 1776. Regarding independence, the Lee Resolution stated, quote, resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, end quote. Several more colonial legislatures still had to decide if they wanted to send delegates to the Congress to support a formal declaration of independence. While these colonies were deciding if they wanted to support independence, on June 11, 1776, Congress appointed the Committee of Five to draft a declaration. Included in this committee were John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, Robert R. Livingston of New York, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut.
All right, so now we have our committee of five, and they're about to get to work. We'll find out in just a few seconds on what they did and what comes next. But first, a history lesson, Bobby.
Don't know much about history.
This is our Don't Know Much About History segment. He was born on April 13th, 1743 on his father's plantation near the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. He was 14 when his father died, and he inherited 2,750 acres of land and about 600 slaves. As a youth, he studied mathematics, history, Latin, Greek, and French. In 1760, he entered the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, and began the study of law. He recorded his first legal case in 1767 and was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, which is what their colonial legislature was known as. 2 years later, he began building a new home on his plantation, which he named Monticello. His first political work to gain acclaim was the 1774 draft of directions for the Virginia delegation to the First Continental Congress. It was titled, quote, "Summary View of the Rights of British America," end quote, in which he maintained that it was not the wish of Virginia to separate from the mother country. 2 years later, as a member of the Second Continental Congress, he was chosen to draft the Declaration of Independence. He then served as governor of Virginia, then minister to France, and then as Secretary of State under the new Constitution and our first president, George Washington. He later was elected as the third president of the United States for 2 terms. He later died on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1826, just a few hours before his friend John Adams. I am, of course, talking about Thomas Jefferson.
All right, Bobbi, let's jump back into this, what you call the Committee of Five, and see what they're up to in the late spring of 1776.
Okay, so after that decision was made on June 11th, 1776, Jefferson holed up in his Philadelphia boarding house and began to write the Declaration. He borrowed freely from existing documents like the Virginia Declaration of Rights and incorporated accepted ideals of the Enlightenment. Jefferson later explained that, quote, he was not striving for originality of principle or sentiment, end quote. Instead, he hoped his words served as, quote, an expression of the American mind, end quote. Less than 3 weeks after he'd begun, he presented his draft to Congress, and I didn't put all the details, but like he and the other committee, they met a couple of times and revised, and it wasn't like he wrote it and it's like, okay, we're going to just take this and run. There were revisions and stuff made. So he presents his draft to Congress on July 2nd, 1776. Congress voted to declare independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, it ratified the text of the Declaration. They made a few more tweaks in those couple of days. What we know of today as the Declaration is what was ratified on July 4th. After ratification, the text of the Declaration was sent off to John Dunlap, an official printer that the Congress used. He worked through the night to set the Declaration in type and print approximately 200 copies. These became known as the Dunlap broadsides. There are still a few of them out there, and they are worth a lot of money.
I would imagine.
These 200 copies were sent to various committees, assemblies, and commanders of the Continental troops. The Dunlap broadsides weren't signed, but John Hancock's name does appear in large type at the bottom. One copy crossed the Atlantic, reaching King George III months later. The official British response scolded the, quote, misguided Americans and their extravagant and inadmissible claim of independency, end quote. On August 2nd, the Journal of the Continental Congress records that, quote, the Declaration of Independence being engrossed and compared at the table was signed. John Hancock, president of the Congress, signed first. And I might add there, we always notice his signature is huge if you look at the actual signed copies. The myth is that he signed it large so that King George III, who had poor eyesight, could see it without his spectacles on. That's not known if that's true. What some think happened is that Hancock just signed it, not thinking of, hey, there's 50 some other people here that need to put their signatures on here.
If you've ever signed a yearbook, you know how that works.
Right, yeah. So I don't know which one's true. They may both be true. Who knows? But his name is on there first. And that's why his type name was typeset on there, because he was presiding over this Continental Congress at the time. So the delegates, after Hancock signed by state from north to south, some signed after August 2nd, a few refused, and George Washington, who was actually part of this, he was away with his troops, so he did not sign the Declaration. Ultimately, though, 56 delegates sign the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Declaration of Independence was meant for multiple audiences: the king and Parliament, the colonists, and the world. It was also meant for multiple purposes: to rally the troops. The American troops so far, the colonial troops, had not had much in the way of anything to be victorious about yet. And they wanted to win foreign allies. They wanted, like, maybe France to come to their aid. So they, were trying to be inspirational here. And they wanted to make sure the world knew that they were creating a new country and why: the United States of America. The introductory sentence states that the Declaration's main purpose to respectfully explain the colonists' right to seek independence, and that sentence ends with, quote, to declare the causes which impelled them to separation, end quote. So their thesis statement for the Declaration. The second paragraph, or second section of the Declaration, contains the lines that most Americans know the best. Quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, end quote. And it goes on that governments derive their power only from, quote, the consent of the governed, end quote. The end of that section states that when a government abuses their rights and subjects them to tyranny or absolute power, they have a right to get rid of that government and create their own. This outlines a general philosophy of government that justifies revolution when government harms natural rights. In other words, Congress had to prove the legitimacy of its cause. It had just defied the most powerful nation on earth. It needed to motivate foreign allies to join the fight. It's their justification for severing political ties with Britain.
I question whether it says we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And I think what it really meant to say was that if you're white and own land.
Right. And I think we've talked before. We need to do an episode on the contradictions of. It's just like, Jefferson wrote those words, but he held slaves. Several hundred slaves. So yeah, I mean, and you have to kind of put it in the context of the time.
Yes.
To us, it seems once we know what that really means. It seems not right, but. You have to take it in. You do. It's
contextual
time.
With the time, yes.
Right. And I do want to go back to, I mentioned a minute or so ago, the Americans needed a victory. And so it's like after this, at the end of 1776, is when Washington decides to take his troops on that wintry night across the Delaware and surprise attack Trenton. And they get that first big victory. And that does help bring France into the war to help us.
Help morale.
It helped morale. It helped, get
patriotism.
Some foreign allies.
Yep.
Exactly. So, and maybe it was because of the Declaration, maybe not. Who knows? But it worked. We'll just put it that way.
Right. We're talking about it 250 years later. It worked.
So after those first two sections of the Declaration, then there's a list of 27 grievances that the colonists held against either the king or the king in Parliament, such as taxation without representation. By outlining the specific abuses of King George III, it provided the legal and moral justification for revolution, proving legitimacy of the colonists' cause to the world. Other grievances besides taxation without representation included the king and Parliament not even following their own laws when dealing with the colonies. Again, they felt themselves to be British citizens, but they weren't being treated like that. I'd also talked about the forced quartering of British troops and stationing more British troops among the colonies, depriving some people of trial by jury, which I might also add is our Sixth Amendment, make sure that we have that right, and cutting off the trade. It made it so that we can only trade with Britain, dissolving legislative bodies. Sometimes they would not allow certain legislative bodies to meet, especially in Massachusetts, because they were, the really naughty ones. Obviously I've only mentioned a few. There were 27 of these types of disagreements or grievances that the colonists found against what the British were doing. So they were, making sure that they justified the action that they were taking here with this Declaration of Independence. The third section describes the colonists' multiple attempts to inform and warn the British people of the king's injustice and the British people's failure to act. In particular, of course, they're, reminding people they didn't just do this on a whim.
Right.
They've already tried to work with the king and parliament to stop this, and they've tried numerous times. It affirms the colonists' ties to the British also as it refers to them as, quote, brethren, end quote. They reiterate again that they had tried to work out their differences and had not been successful. Then in the next part, in one sentence, they officially announce their separation from Britain. In the last section, the signers assert that the conditions exist under which people must change their government, that the British have produced such conditions, and by necessity, the colonies must sever political ties with the British king and government and become independent states. It officially refers for the first time to the United States of America, and that says that they are free and independent states with the right to govern themselves. So there's our birth certificate.
Right.
We were born. These men that signed the Declaration of Independence put their lives on the line for the ideals set forth in the document. If the Americans would have lost the Revolutionary War, they would have been put to death for treason.
Certainly.
But they believed in these ideas of natural rights and liberty, of a social contract and consent of the governed, equality, accountability, and unification. These ideas were soon incorporated into the fabric of our nation through the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights. The signers believed that they were doing the right thing, but they also knew what the stakes were. Benjamin Franklin, while discussing this with another delegate at the Continental Congress, said, quote, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately," end quote. And he meant that literally.
Yes.
Because they would have been put to death by hanging if they had lost the war and been found guilty of treason. If they didn't succeed, they were traitors and they'd be put to death. And their lives were literally on the line for doing this. But they had about 5 more years of war to fight before they knew what their fate would be and whether this new United States of America would survive or just be a dream. As we celebrate our breakup with the British and the birth of the United States of America 250 years ago, let us not lose sight of what it is we are celebrating. The Declaration of Independence has inspired so many others around the world in the years since its writing. In it, the founders gave us their justification for political separation from England and their philosophy of government. That philosophy contains values that Americans have continued to struggle and sometimes shed blood for since 1776. A Constitution and Bill of Rights followed that further enshrined the values and ideals set forth in this Declaration of Independence. These values and ideals include equality of liberty for all and the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, secured by a government created for that purpose with its limited powers derived from the consent of the governed or the people. Over the course of our 250 years of history, various groups have often had to fight for that equality and these rights. And there have been disagreements over what various parts of the Constitution and Bill of Rights mean, but those struggles have always been able to be resolved, sometimes by war and violence, sometimes by the courts, and sometimes by our government itself. But so far, we have always come through these struggles to maintain this great nation based on the struggle and ideals set forth by the Declaration of Independence. Today, it seems too many Americans have lost sight of these founding principles and why they are important to maintaining our freedom. As authoritarian impulses grow around the world and we see more expanding and largely unaccountable government actions and abuses limiting liberty and trampling rights, we must breathe some life into the founding principles of the Declaration of Independence. We must remember that we are not the servants of our government, and our rights do not come from the government, but from the fact that we are humans, and the government gets its powers from us, the people, and the government exists to secure our rights. So as you watch the fireworks on July 4th, think about what those fireworks are actually celebrating and why we need to continue to strive to maintain this nation as conceived by the men who set forth the ideals in the Declaration of Independence 250 years ago, ideals that they were willing to risk their own lives for.
Who wants to follow this act? Where do we go from here?
Next time, I think we're going to talk about civic virtue as kind of a follow-up to this, because I think a lot of people have lost sight of what we're celebrating.
For sure.
And I know sadly, a lot of the celebrations, especially in our nation's capital, are kind of centered more around a man rather than what it is we're celebrating. We'll talk about civic virtue next time to try to inspire people to, again, get more involved, to get more of an understanding of our government and how it's supposed to work and what they need to be holding their representatives accountable for.
And something that we can announce today officially is this fall, you and I will be doing a class at the Kokomo Howard County Library, and it will be entitled How to Be a Better Citizen. So that goes right along with what we're talking about here. And I think we can all be better citizens. There's room for all of us to grow. There's room for all of us to learn. There's room for all of us to try to understand our neighbors a little bit better, get back out there and try to have a dialogue, and let's push through our differences and try to make a change.
As you say that, I mean, I think, I know a lot about this stuff. As I do these episodes and do research, I almost every time find at least one thing, sometimes more than that I'm like, oh, I didn't realize that. So, there's always room to learn more. Before we finish this up, I bought a couple months ago, it's a book that had just come out. It's a very tiny book, 67 pages.
Ooh, that's a
by
quick
Walter
read.
Isaacson. Who wrote he did a biography of Franklin, of Leonardo da Vinci. I think he did the one on Elon Musk. He's written several books, but his book is entitled The Greatest Sentence Ever Written, which is the We Hold These Truths to Be Self-Evident. And it's just a tiny book, and he goes through each of those lines and kind of explains briefly and in a way that it's easy to read and understand how those words came about, what the background is. And then it's got a little appendix that has like the Declaration and some other, like the Virginia Declaration of Rights is in there, which I mentioned in this episode. Jefferson used some of. So it's just a very short, simple book that anybody can read and make sense of that helps, again, to understand the Declaration a little more.
And you mentioned this earlier, but if we did a deeper dive on the Declaration of Independence, we did a deeper dive on the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights.
Right, it was several episodes long.
Yeah. So, and that was right after we first started doing this podcast in year one, and we're getting into the second half of season 2 now. So lots of stuff to go back and review if you want to take a deeper dive on that. But right now, it's time for the pop quiz.
Last episode's question is, who is the governor of your state right now? And as we said, those answers would vary because we have listeners from actually all over the United States and
the world,
places around the world. Yeah. And of course, if you live in Indiana, the answer is our governor is Braun.
Mike Braun.
I couldn't think of his first name. So, again, you'll have to check yourself on that one, but it's something that you should know. And if you were taking the citizenship test, you might be asked.
Yeah, and as we learn to be better citizens, that's one thing you can do is find out what the issues are in your state. Right now, AI data centers are huge all over the country. There are so many things that are happening. Electrical rates are skyrocketing. So knowing your governor and then making that phone call to his office or to his workers, they'll get the message to him, but it is important for you to know who your representatives are, especially the leader of the state, and weigh in. If you don't weigh in, they can't read minds, and they're going to listen to what they hear the most, and that's going to be the people that are lobbying and are...
And it doesn't take much to know who the governor is and who your local state representative to your state government is and your state senator, as well as federal.
Yeah, or U.S.
2 senators and 1 representative. That's like 7 people that you need to know. So it's not difficult. And of course, talked about the 5 Calls app. If you want to get a hold of them easily, that's a very easy way to do it. You mentioned the data centers. As I was driving somewhere the other day, I kept seeing all these signs out, like realtor signs that say no data centers. And I think, let's see, a year or so ago, they were no electric fields or, or no wind power. It's like, what we're upset about keeps changing and the signs keep changing.
The data centers people are starting to wake up, I think, with those, and only because they're starting to come to their communities, right? And lots of times we don't get invested in a topic until it's either too late or it's at our front door. But I think a lot of people, not just in Indiana, but all over, are finding out, okay, these data centers, how much energy are they using? Can our electrical grid, where we're at, currently handle it? And if not, who's paying for it? And where's the water coming from that's going to...
Is that why our electric rates are going up?
Right. So that is definitely a topic that I'm flagging for our listeners. I'm not telling you which side of the coin to take to support on that, but it's definitely one that's going to dramatically change your community if it comes. But definitely plug in to those data centers, because there's a lot of legislation going on right now. I know there was some new legislation that was just introduced this week. Man, I got way off on that. I'm sorry. I got up on my soapbox.
We just have the next question.
Yes. What is our question?
It's going to be kind of similar. The answers are going to vary on this. Again, something you might need to know if you took this test. What is the capital of your state? Or I put on there, or country, since we do have people outside. But if you were taking the naturalization test, you would be asked, what's the capital of the state that you're living in? Something you should know. And, I remember once a long time ago when I was teaching geography, and I would give the kids they would have to learn the states and capitals. And I had a kid argue with me that, everybody will know, our state. And no, I had like, I don't know, 5 classes of, let's say, 30 students each at that time. No, I had a handful of kids at the 7th grade level that did not know what the capital of Indiana was, and they had lived here all their lives.
All right, so that looks like we're going to wrap things up for this episode. But before we go, I want to remind you, be in touch with us. Follow us on our Facebook page, Plain Civics. Just go on there and type that in, and you'll find us. There's lots of information on there that we put on after different episodes. The pop quiz answers also get put on there. Happy Independence Day to you, Bobbi. We'll be celebrating. Thank you. We'll be celebrating that soon as a nation, a big one, the 250th this year. So fun to talk about how we got our birth certificate, as you put it today, and now we have the history of that. So thanks for putting the legwork into this and being our brain for this episode. So that's it for this episode of Plain Civics, breaking down the basics. No politics, just facts. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.
This is Plain Civics. Join us for the journey as we break down the basics of how government works, so you can make the government work for you.